It's the real news. I'm Aaron Mate. President Trump and Kim Jong-Un have announced historic talks that could lead to denuclearizing North Korea. But rather than embrace the move, some of President Trump's centrist critics are voicing alarm. Here, for example, is Rachel Maddow of MSNBC.
Why has that never happened in all the decades North Korea has existed as a nation? Why hasn't any other president ever done? Should I take that to mean that this might be a particularly risky or even an unwise move? See, I think that's how most presidents would approach the idea of a personal presidential meeting with the North Korean dictator. I think a lot of people probably suspect tonight that those are not the kinds of questions that this president asked himself before agreeing to this meeting. But this is the president we have, and he said yes to North Korea.
And earlier today on the same network, Joe Scarborough of Morning Joe spoke to MSNBC chief foreign correspondent Andrea Mitchell.
Andrea, let's talk really briefly for people who may not be aware of it, but talk about how the North Koreans have made fools of every American president since Bill Clinton.
Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, even though he then called them the evil empire, and Barack Obama, all three fooled a former president, Jimmy Carter, going in 1994 and getting fooled and misled by Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il. I was there during negotiations with the previously the highest ranking American to ever meet with a North Korean leader was Madeleine Albright. So in October of 2000, we went, and they were going to normalize relations. And then George W. Bush hit the pause button on that when he was elected in March in March of 2001. But they've all been, they've cheated in every instance.
And even
In part one of this conversation, we were joined by Christine Ahn of Women Cross DMZ, but she had to leave us. But we are still joined by Tim Shorrock, independent journalist who covers U.S.-Korea relations for The Nation and the Korea Center for Investigative Reporting. Welcome, Tim. If you could address that brief history that Andrea Mitchell just outlined, where she talks about a history of North Korea fooling the U.S. Is that accurate?
No, it's not accurate at all. The media, including NBC, is pumping lies out one after the other about the U.S. and North Korea, this history of diplomacy that's happened. But you notice the last thing she said, she talked about the Clinton agreement. Then she said Bush kind of put the kibosh on that, or didn't get her exact words. But yeah, there was an agreement, under which North Korea froze its nuclear processing for 12 years. And then at the end of the 90s, under the Clinton administration, they came very close to that trip, she was talking about when she went to Pyongyang with Madeleine Albright. Clinton came extremely close to an agreement. They had an agreement in principle for North Korea to end all its missile tests and to normalize relations with the United States. In other words, North Korea at that time was willing to trade, their weapon program and their missile program, for a better relationship with the United States. And then when Bush came to power, he rejected the idea of negotiating with Kim Jong-il, who was then the leader of North Korea. And in 2002, they torpedoed the agreement between the U.S. and North Korea, under which the program was frozen. They torpedoed it by telling North Korea, saying that you have started a uranium program, which the North Koreans denied, but they said they had a right to one. But the U.S. refused to negotiate about it and just said, okay, the agreement's over because you're on a uranium track. And that was the end of that. And within a couple of years, North Korea, after that, when the Bush administration pulled the rug out from under the agreement, North Korea kicked out the IAEA inspectors that were in there and proceeded to, build its nuclear capability. And by 2006, they had exploded their first atomic bomb. So, like every day you hear in the media, on NBC and CNN, they'll say, oh, the North Korea broke its agreements the next day, and so on and so forth. There's no careful look at the role that the U.S. played. I mean, the Republicans torpedoed the agreement. They criticized the agreement when it was passed. They accused, Clinton of, like Neville Chamberlain type of action with North Korea, and caving into North Korean demands. and so forth. And the North Koreans, after a while, even while the agreement was in place, they felt the U.S. was not meeting its terms. So the U.S. has a pretty bad history here too, and the media just completely rejects this idea of even looking at the history. They just pump out the mistruths one after the other.
Right. So 2 points there. Under Clinton, the U.S. was supposed to help build reactors, right? But that never fully materialized. And then also, you mentioned North Korea testing a bomb in 2006. What's interesting about that, I think, is that after Bush had called off talks and basically abandoned diplomacy, it was North Korea with that show of force testing a bomb that prompted Bush to go back to the negotiating table, embrace talks, and approve, these six-party talks that that actually got somewhere, at least for a bit.
Exactly. And, it's important to note here that, 3 weeks after that first bomb was exploded, Bush approved Condoleezza Rice to open negotiations with North Korea. 3 weeks after their first bomb was exploded. So, they were in a mood for negotiating after that. Unfortunately, when you look at the history of the six-party talks, and actually the history of all these negotiations, what's very important is when you have a progressive president in South Korea, things move forward. When you have a right-wing conservative president in South Korea, things move backward. In 2008, after 10 years of progressive presidents who, Kim Dae-jung and his successor, Roh Moo-hyun, they had this policy, the Sunshine Policy toward North Korea, which was based on engagement and diplomacy and sports diplomacy and all that, exchanges across the border to build trust. That went out the window in 2008 when you had a conservative leader elected in South Korea, and he immediately, like the Republicans did before, rejected the agreement that was made in 1994 and began, the negotiations were already underway. And then this new South Korean president, Lee Myung-bak, began to demand that the additional conditions be put on North Korea for inspections and that kind of thing. North Korea rejected that. When Obama came in, he endorsed a hard line from Lee Myung-bak, and the hard line continued through the next president, Park Geun-hye. And so, when you have these conservative presidents, it makes the situation worse, which is why the role of Moon Jae-in has been so important here.
But Tim, speaking of Obama, drawing on your formula there about what happens under progressive or conservative presidents in South Korea, is it fair to say that under a liberal president like Obama, things also pretty much go nowhere because Obama did not put much diplomatic force behind reaching a settlement with North Korea? His doctrine was one of strategic patience, which critics say was basically a euphemism for doing nothing. And if that's true, I wonder, does that maybe explain some of the liberal angst we're seeing right now over Trump's decision to engage in a direct meeting with Kim Jong-un?
I think that's part of it. I mean, these people that love Obama never took a careful look at what he did with Korea. I mean, Obama said when he was running that he would be willing to meet the leader of North Korea, but he focused all his attention on Iran. When it came to North Korea, as I said, he sided with, the South Korean conservatives, and also conservatives, regained power in Japan as well. And also, you have to remember that, under Obama and when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, they began this process of, building up U.S. forces in the Pacific. They call it the Asia pivot, the Pacific pivot. And so this was kind of aimed at China also, encircling China and building up U.S. military forces in Asia. So, peace with North Korea or the negotiations with North Korea kind of went against that whole policy of the U.S. military buildup in Asia, which continued through the Obama administration. And Obama never once got involved in, direct negotiations with North Korea, even though, delegates came, people came from the United States, former officials that meet with North Korea now and then in these sort of track 2 negotiations that have been going on throughout this time. They came back like in 2010, 2011 with North Korean offers to have a peace agreement. and get rid of all their plutonium and send it to a third country, made offers like that to Obama. He never took them up on it. So I guess they're they don't want to take any criticism of Obama's foreign policy.
That's a critical point there, I think, about Obama and U.S. forces in South Korea and the role of China in that. Because if you're committed to confronting China, it's a lot easier to justify keeping 30,000 or so U.S. troops in South Korea if you're able to claim that you have to counter this North Korean enemy that stands in the middle of South Korea and China. Let me finally ask you, Tim, there's some speculation among liberal critics that all this was done by Trump to deflect away from the scandal engulfing him around this former mistress of his, this woman with whom he had an affair, Stormy Daniels. But also, the other thing that puzzles me about the discourse is that it's taken to be odd that North Korea wants to be treated as equals with the U.S. So let me read to you from Nick Kristof, the liberal columnist for the New York Times. He writes today, "What North Korean leaders have craved for many years is international respect and credibility. They want to be treated as equals by the Americans, so a scene of Trump and Kim standing side by side would constitute a triumph for Pyongyang." And this to me reflects sort of a broader trend that it's somehow seen as untoward or strange that North Koreans want to be treated as equals with the U.S. And I'm wondering, are we supposed to not see them as equals? Are they lesser than we are?
Well, that's how they want you to see them. Yes, they're an evil regime. They should be eliminated. Basically, that's the line, I think. That this is it. And so, yeah, they, Nick Kristof and these other liberals wringing their hands about this. A country that wants to, protect its sovereignty and stand up with deterrence, like a deterrence system like nuclear weapons to protect its own sovereignty, is something that seems to be a great affront to these liberals when it's North Korea. And I think these are all excuses just to avoid the fact that if you want to have a settlement of this crisis that so worries people, then you have to have direct negotiations with North Korea. That's the only way to do it. This is a conflict between the United States and North Korea. They've made that clear. North Korea has made this very clear. Their weapons are aimed at the U.S. because they feel the U.S. has aimed its weapons at them for 60 years, and they want to end this state of hostility. That's what North Korea is trying to do. And that's what I think Moon Jae-in has listened to. And they've made some very major concessions to get here.
Tim, let me ask you quickly on this point about Korean agency. Who knows what's going on in President Trump's mind? As I said, there's speculation about whether or not it was motivated by a need to deflect from the Stormy Daniels controversy. Who knows with him? But in terms of what otherwise may have motivated him to make this decision, what do you think that was? And did actually South Korea's diplomacy that you have been outlining, and Christine Ahn as well did in part one of this conversation, did that sort of box him in to force him to make a move?
In a way, it really did. There was a point last summer where there was a report on NBC News that greatly concerned the South Korean government and greatly concerned Moon Jae-in, which was the U.S. had plans to launch a unilateral attack from the air by B-1B bombers flying in international airspace that could destroy nuclear sites and missile sites in a way that wouldn't require the South Koreans to be involved. And when Moon Jae-in heard about that, he immediately had his national security advisor call McMaster and call the White House and say, don't you dare do an attack on North Korea without, talking to us and without our involvement. And I think that was a kind of a critical turning point because, since the beginning, since he took the presidency, Moon Jae-in has insisted that South Korea must be in the driver's seat of the Korea peace process. And he is in the driver's seat. He is the engine behind this. And I think what happened was, it was totally coincidence that it sort of intersected with, these salacious stories about, Trump's affair with his porn star. The fact is, the Olympics happened. There was talks during the Olympics, and then Moon Jae-in government sent, his two national security advisors, including the head of intelligence, to North Korea. They had long talks with Kim Jong-Un, unprecedented talks there. And then they came back, and Moon Jae-in wanted these people to come and tell the United States what had happened and fill them in on, what North Korea had offered. And that was the point of their mission to the White House yesterday. And when Trump was briefed about it, he urged the South Koreans to make the announcement. And that's what happened. And I think it was kind of symbolic that the announcement was made solely by the South Koreans. I was glad to see that there wasn't Trump standing next to them, or McMaster. I think probably McMaster, who's been pushing for a war, his national security advisor, probably didn't even want to be part of this process. But I think it's really, it just happened to coincide with these stories about his scandals. But I think for Trump, a wag the dog scenario would be much more likely, with a war. I mean, war is what brings a country together, right? And it lets you forget, domestic issues and domestic crises. But, embarking on a peace process with North Korea doesn't really make you popular here. So, so I don't really, buy this. I just think it's a silly way to for people to look at this and discount the South Korean role.
It's amazing our capacity here in the West to deny other parts of the world their agency. We'll leave it there. Tim Shorrock, independent journalist, covers U.S. Korea relations for The Nation and the Korea Center for Investigative Reporting. Tim, thank you.
Thanks so much, Aaron.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.